So by some freak of scheduling, you get me a game. I guess this morning I spoke about diaconate as equal opportunity. This afternoon as ecumenical opportunity. So when I speak about the ecumenical opportunities presented by the diaconate, I want to start with ecumenical in the broadest sense. Oikumene, meaning the whole inhabited earth. We aren't just talking about interdenominational understanding, but about a perspective that embraces religion, thought, and politics, and that recognizes every human pursuit as subject to the healing ministry of Christ. And within that perspective, we're considering what diaconia might mean in its broadest sense. I believe we are talking about God's longing for all who inhabit the earth to live in shalom, in harmony with one another and creation. I like to borrow the Hebrew word tikkun olam to talk about our human responsibility to join with God in mending what is wrong with the world. The world isn't mended by what we do alone. Mending is something that happens when we make space for a new life to emerge. That is the diaconal project of the church. God's mission, incarnated in Jesus, demonstrated the depth and breadth of that longing and the human cost of that mending. A mark of God's mission is that it was directed to the least among us. So for me, diaconia takes on the meaning of mission and ministry, and also the way in which Jesus lived that ministry, the way he challenged the principalities and powers of the world, the way he responded with compassion and healing toward the anawim, the little ones, who are so often excluded and oppressed by the systems that are created and maintained by those principalities and powers. So oikumene in the broadest sense, diaconia in the broadest sense, just to put in perspective what we're here about. I want to start with a bit of a personal introduction. I do feel that in some ways I'm uniquely qualified to speak about ecumenical opportunities with regard to the diaconate in the more narrow and focused sense of ecumenical. My own vocational journey has been very ecumenical. After I graduated with my first degree in Toronto, I spent 2 years in Oxford, where I lived in the house of St. Gregory and St. Macrina, operated by the Orthodox chaplaincy. I did study enough Russian as an undergraduate that I could follow the Slavonic alphabet. So I sang in the choir in the Divine Liturgy most Sundays of the 2 years that I was there, having risen at dawn to get to an Anglican Eucharist first. In fact, my first morning there on a Sunday, my room was directly above the chapel. I was awakened by the deep voice of the deacon singing the prayer of the faithful in Old Slavonic. Actually, that person was Kallistos Ware, whom some may be known to you. When I returned to Canada in the 1970s, I wrestled with a sense of call just at the time that women were being considered for ordination to the priesthood in the Anglican Church of Canada and in the Episcopal Church. For various reasons, I did not feel drawn to parish ministry. I did not feel that it was my call to preside at weddings and funerals and parish politics. I was much more interested in the church's mission in the world, especially in local neighborhoods. And at this point, I was introduced actually through my friend Allison. It was Allison who said, "Come to this conference on the diaconate." And this movement to restore the diaconate as a ministry and order with its own integrity was home for me. So since then, I have experienced many ecumenical expressions and explorations of the diaconate. In 1995, I participated in an Anglican Lutheran consultation on the diaconate and a special meeting of the Anglican Lutheran International Commission, resulting in the Hanover Report, The Diaconal as Ecumenical Opportunity, from which this session gets its name. But I have to say, at the time, I was doing very difficult and urgent kind of inner city work, and ended up traveling across to Europe and meeting in a castle in Hanover and drinking out of, crystal glasses. And It felt like a disconnect. But I witnessed in that experience a deep respect and openness and attentiveness that characterized the dialogue between those two churches, and realized how important a witness this was of striving to be in unity. Also, in the 1990s, I participated as an observer in the Working Party of the House of Bishops of the Church of England that produced the 2001 study, At Such a Time of This, a Renewed Diaconate in the Church of England. And my friend Suzanne Watson-Epting was at that gathering as well. When I was on sabbatical in 2003, I visited Thésée, where I met a Roman Catholic deacon from the Diocese of Meaux, which includes the Charles de Gaulle Airport in its boundaries. He had a special commission from his bishop for youth ministry and was taking a group of young people on a pilgrimage for a weekend. His day job was cleaning graffiti for the city of Paris. He and his family hosted me just before I returned to Canada at their home in Meaux. And he took me around and introduced me to the other clergy. I think they were all presbyters. I think he was actually the only deacon serving in that small diocese. And so besides attending to young people, he also did a lot of marriage preparation and presiding at weddings. And he told couples not to call him father, as the only people who did so were his two children. It was an encounter that gave me a vision of what the diaconate could be, especially if embraced, supported, and used by the diocesan bishop. In his day job, he exemplified the cleaning up the cosmic mess that the diaconate is about. He worked with young people. He supplemented the stretched ministry of the diocese and lived a wonderful and faithful life. And so my life, and then again, for the past 6 years, I served as principal of the Center for Christian Studies, which I introduced you to this morning, based in Winnipeg, a small theological college that represents the coming together of Anglican and United Church training schools for women. It now prepares women and men primarily for diaconal ministry in the United Church of Canada. I did my level best in the 6 years I was there, Bishop Don, to open it to Anglican usage, and I hope it continues in that direction, Heather. So my life as a deacon has given me insight from the Orthodox tradition, the Anglican Communion, from Lutheranism, and the Reform and Methodist tradition of the United Church of Canada. I've also had the chance to participate in ecumenical associations, including 2 assemblies of the World Diaconia, one in Durham and one in Chicago just last year, and several gatherings of Diaconia of the Americas and the Caribbean. And I might add, as Bishop Bolin mentioned, I've just been recruited to the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue of Canada. So that's my personal story of ecumenism in the diaconate. But I now want to shift to the context in which I began to explore the diaconate. When I was working on my Master of Divinity, I wrote a thesis on the diaconate as a ministry of servanthood and leadership. And in the years after, I have continued to seek to deepen my understanding of this office. At that time, I found a wealth of material to draw from. One was the 1979 Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church. It was foundational in my thinking about ministry. The biggest innovation in the American Prayer Book revision was to reestablish the primacy and centrality of baptism as the key rite of initiation into Christian life. And both the scholarship that went into that and then the lyrical way in which it was incorporated into the text of the Book of Common Prayer completely turned my assumptions of ministry and ordination and the nature of the church on its head. A second source that was important was the work of Bishop Wes Frensdorf, Bishop of Nevada, at the time assisted by Fina, not assisted, but working in team with Fina Borgeson, who is here. And that was foundational to my understanding of the diaconate. It began to give life to his role and work in the Diocese of Nevada began to give life to a new vision of baptism and ministry, which became known as total ministry, and we experienced it by different names. Local collaborative ministry is another. Based on the recognition that the Holy Spirit is active in local communities of the faithful and not defined by theological degrees or restricted to the hierarchical structures of the church alone. He spoke of the orders as offices within the life and mission of the church that gives sacramental focus to the corporate ministry of the baptized. A third document that was fundamental and that has been named already was the World Council of Churches document, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, published in 1982, the same year I was working on my thesis. It inspired me with its clear and very positive overview, not only of baptism and the nature of church, but the concept of a threefold ministry as grounds for ecumenical understanding. And then fourth, another key document was Schillebeeck's book that also just appeared at the time, Ministry, Leadership in the Community of Jesus Christ, Edward Schillebeeck. He was one of the most active theologians at the Vatican II Council and exercised important influence on the document Lumen Gentium. And if I'm wrong, correct me, but that's what I understand. A doctrinal restatement of the nature of church, which shifted emphasis from a fixed and hierarchical view of church and ministry to one that envisioned a more balanced and collegial exercise of authority. Lumen Gentium also endorsed the revival of the office of deacon as found in the early church as a permanent vocation. So together, these documents represent a deep ecumenical awakening that was happening at the time. The 1979 Book of Common Prayer, the canons for total ministry in the Diocese of Nevada and the Episcopal Church, baptism, Eucharist, and ministry of the World Council of Churches, Lumen Gentium of Vatican II. I confess that I expected a more visible and lively renewal of the church and its ministry, which has unfolded at a much, much slower pace than I anticipated. I'm glad that I had such a strong sense of call to the diaconate. It really was like a road to Damascus kind of experience, and if I didn't have that, I don't think I could have lasted all this time. So I want to talk about my understanding of diaconia and its relationship to the diaconate. How do the Anglican Church of Canada and the Episcopal Church understand the diaconate? The service of ordination in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, similar to the one in the 1985 Book of Alternative Services of the Anglican Church of Canada, is a good place to start. I often point out these distinguishing features in the service of ordination for a deacon as compared to that of a priest or presbyter. Deacons are called to a special ministry of servanthood directly under the authority of the bishop. Priests, on the other hand, or presbyters, are called, this I'm taking from the text of the ordination service, to work as pastor, priest, and teacher, together with the bishop and fellow presbyters, and to take their share in the councils of the church. So clearly, deacons are accountable to their bishop, presbyters are part of a council. Second, deacons are to serve all people, especially the poor, the weak, the sick, and the lonely. Presbyters, on the other hand, are to care alike for young and old, strong and weak, rich and poor. Their ministry is embracive and total. The emphatic mandate of deacons is to care for those at the margins, those who are at risk of being forgotten. Third, deacons are to interpret to the church the needs, concerns, and hopes of the world. Don't forget the hopes part. Presbyters are to preach, declare God's forgiveness, and pronounce God's blessing. And I'll speak to this distinction again further. And then fourth, deacons are to assist the bishop and presbyters in administering God's word and sacraments and to carry out other duties as assigned. Sometimes that's what defines the diaconate more than anything else. Presbyters are to preside at baptism, which is also something that can be done by deacons or the baptized, to preside at baptism and Eucharist, and other ministrations, it says, entrusted to them, so that distinction between assigned and entrusted. Clearly, the emphasis is on the servanthood aspect of the diaconate and its role of serving the poor and the helpless. This was a reflection of the meaning that scholars commonly ascribe to the Greek word diakonia, most often translated within the New Testament as ministry or humble or lowly service. But has already been mentioned, the work of John N. Collins, which didn't appear, in fact, until 1994, well after I wrote my thesis, has challenged this consensus. His study of diaconia and its cognates concluded that the word is better understood to mean the carrying out of a commissioned task, rather than the more traditional humble service. By extension, his reinterpretation emphasizes the functions of a diakonos as being a messenger or go-between, an agent or ambassador. Incidentally, I sometimes wonder whether I felt a call to the diaconate because my father was an ambassador. An attendant to a household or an important person charged with a particular task or responsibility. The Hanover Report strives for a compromise by summing up diaconal ministers as those who are called to be agents of the church in interpreting and meeting needs, hopes, and concerns within church and society. So they tried to cover all their bases: agents, needs, church, society. When I talk about the ministry of deacons, I usually prefer to stay with the Greek word diakonia, because I don't think we've settled yet on a precise and commonly agreed upon translation. I love Ormond Plater's popularization of the folk etymology of diaconia as through the dust. It conveys the idea of a fast-moving messenger, a courier, someone who urgently carries important news from one person to another. Movement is what characterizes the core principle of diaconia. He also compares the role of deacons to that of angelic messengers, such as Gabriel visiting Mary of Nazareth, or the angels who ministered to Jesus in the wilderness. This image of deacon as angelic messenger I really like. And actually, if you look at certain icons or certain representations of heraldry, it often shows angels wearing the dalmatic of a deacon. The stance taken by baptism, Eucharist, and ministry confirmed the need for a more credible expression of the diaconate by more clearly linking the diaconal role of service into the world with liturgical functions. In 2002, Deaconess Louise Williams, who was then president of the Diaconia of the Caribbean, of the Americas and the Caribbean, and also was the head or director of the Lutheran Deaconess community, gave a keynote address in Winnipeg on 5 images of diaconia. It was based on an article in Christine Hall's book of essays on the diaconate by Antonia Lynn, as we might have once thought. In the Book of Common Prayer, they said it is obvious since the time of the apostles and the early church that there are 3 orders: bishop, priest, and deacon. But when I did my thesis, I found that this was not obvious at all. Our mutual task then is to attend to the nuances of our shared and separate histories with regard to the diaconate and to other orders, to discern what to recover, what to let go of, and what to adapt creatively to our context. Second, your formal processes of decision-making and authority. While Vatican II initiated the reestablishment of the permanent diaconate as a major part of the sacrament of orders, implementation was left to local episcopal conferences. Not all such conferences took action, but enough to give the diaconate a robust presence in the Church's official ministry, and to make it a substantial theme in the renewal of clerical leadership in the Roman Catholic Church of today. It appears your formal processes have given gravitas, weight, to the decision and momentum to enacting it. I do find that the fuzziness of Anglican decision-making sometimes leads people to think that the restoration of the diaconate is a matter of personal opinion. And they'll say, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think deacons should be that. This is what I, and it's just a free-for-all of who can do what defined by whom. And I'm seeing nods of agreement. Third, your high standards of formation for the diaconate, which appear to be more consistent and rigorous than in many parts of the Anglican Church of Canada. Though contextual factors are important, I wonder whether practices that vary so greatly of what it takes to form someone and consider them ready for the diaconate are what make it so difficult to know what the glue is that holds the diaconal order together. And fourth, there's many more I could make, many more, but anyway, your emphasis on stable personal life and the balance of family life and ministry, marked by the practice of including the spouses of diaconal candidates in training and formation, and even requiring their participation. It's just something that we could learn from. I also think Anglicans have something to share. Our experience of women who served as deaconesses or deacons because they didn't have other options for authorized ministry. In many ways, they breathed life and vitality into the diaconate and themselves became enriched by their time in that order. We have much to learn from the creativity, resourcefulness, flexibility, and pioneering spirit of these women who went on to assume other forms of leadership when it became possible. On the other hand, our experience of women and men in the diaconate because they want to and feel called to be there. At times, the diaconate has functioned as a kind of holding place for women who really felt called to the priesthood, and it may be in the Roman Catholic Church for married men who feel called to the priesthood. But now that that option has been opened to them, the diaconate has been able to claim its own distinctiveness and integrity. I would just say as an aside, this might be a violation of the integrity or core meaning of what the diaconate is. But I think one of its corporate roles in the church is to be useful, to fill gaps when they need to be filled. And so if it gets, kind of diverted a little bit, it still fills that function. And people learn from it. I really appreciated what Alison said this morning about we're learning as we're going. It's not something that's fixed. I'm coming down to home stretch here. And then what we have learned from total ministry or local collaborative ministry, a model that takes seriously the presence and activity of the Holy Spirit in local communities while heeding the importance of the Catholicity and universality of orders. I think it's a model that is fraught with problems and challenges, but I would far rather deal with the problems and challenges presented by that model than by the alternative. So finally, let me borrow good ideas from the Hanover Report for enjoying the ecumenical opportunity presented by a renewed diaconate. Sharing the ministry of deacons and diaconal ministers of either tradition, borrowing or seconding deacons in areas where one or the other tradition is sparsely represented. Joint presentations at synodical or convention gatherings on the needs, concerns, and hopes of the world as perceived and experienced by deacons. Invitations to deacons of one tradition to participate in the liturgies of another. One of the freedoms of the diaconate is that it's not church dividing. So the world isn't going to fall apart. If we invite a deacon from the other tradition to participate in our liturgy, correct me if I'm wrong. Opening up diaconal associations to membership of both traditions. It would be wonderful if we had Roman Catholic deacons who participated in the Anglican Association of Deacons, and if you have your association, if we could join in with yours. Initiating demonstration projects using pooled resources from both churches to encourage experimentation and learning with regard to new patterns of stipendiary and non-stipendiary ministry, theological and ministerial training and formation, encouraging and supporting churches which may not at this time have a diaconate to initiate a diaconate as appropriate to their ministry needs. One of the things I appreciate about the principle of receptive ecumenism is the awareness that there is a spiritual process whereby the decisions of council or formal bodies of the church become part of the life of the local church, and vice versa. There is opportunity to learn from each other what we have experienced in the course of that spiritual process, as we have already begun to at this gathering. And as articulated by baptism, Eucharist, and ministry, receptive ecumenism gives us the chance to learn and benefit from the richness of the whole oikumene, to help each other focus on our identity in a way that helps us learn, grow, and change, and to become true to our apostolic origins. May it be so.
I don't know how much I'll be dissecting, but I certainly have a few thoughts to share, both in light of the two presentations we just heard, but also in light of some of the earlier conversations we've had so far at the conference. And then I want to share just a little bit at the end of some practical things that have already been done, are going to be done, and might be done here in our local context. I'll note that the ecumenical opportunity of the diaconate, when I first got here, I thought of the diaconal opportunity of ecumenism, because I was brought here to establish and run a diaconate formation program, and many people had questions about that. And very often, the people with serious questions about running a diaconate formation program, at least in the Roman Catholic context, are people who are quite ecumenically engaged. And so I would say, well, we've spent decades working with other Christian communities, and we very strongly sort of insisted, especially to communities that had lost the episcopate, on a threefold structure of ministry. It was very awkward that we had a lot of dioceses that didn't have it. But I was struck near the end by Mélan's comment about the kind of free-for-all about maybe Anglican attitudes towards the diaconate. But of course, if we're honest about our Roman Catholic attitudes, having it in some places in the world, not others, in some dioceses and not others, has contributed to our own sort of confusion about exactly what this diaconate thing is, right? So it may take slightly different forms in Anglican and Catholic circles, but there are some similar questions about just what exactly is this. And I think there's a certain solidarity among Anglican and Roman Catholic deacons about sort of being misunderstood in their own communions, right? And I think this is interesting for ecumenism. I mean, one of the strange parallels is that, of course, ecumenists are people who are misunderstood in their own communions, and are often, have a certain affinity with one another when they go to their meetings, and a lot of times feel like they share something in common with other ecumenists that they wish they could communicate back home to their own communities. And I wonder if there might be some sort of, not perfect, but sort of vague parallel here between the experience of diaconate across different denominational lines. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about this, and it came up in earlier discussions, do we better understand diaconal ministry as ministry ad extra, get outside the walls of the church, or ad intra, because it is an ordained ministry of the church? And I think something that got a lot of nods in the room was when the image of the step or the door at the front of the church, and the deacon being the person to help people move both ways across it, which says there's something true about both the ad extra and the ad intra realities of diaconal ministry. And it seems to me that ecumenism actually is one of those things that's kind of at the door. Ecumenism is something where we should be doing it. We don't always know how to do it. It doesn't always, and sometimes it can't impact everything that's going on ad intra. And if we consider the Lund principle, which Bishop Don started with, well, there are some things ad intra that we can't do with other Christians. And then there are also many things ad extra that we can do. And so the deacon is kind of crossing that line very often between the things we can't do together and the things we can do together. And I think this is really, we get a real image of this when we consider the relationship between the liturgical function of the deacon and the service of charity. Mélan had this quote from Bill Ditwig I won't have it exactly right, I sketched it out quickly, but that charity and justice are functions of word and sacrament. It is not simply that deacons have this liturgical role over here, and they have this other role over here, and sometimes, I can't remember who mentioned it in one of the earlier presentations, that we sort of put primacy on this role of charity, and we don't want to play up the liturgy too much, you know. And I think, I appreciate the caution there, and when we're doing discernment with people who are interested in diaconate, if you have someone who just can't wait to get in the sanctuary and get their hands on the holy stuff, that's usually a kind of red flag, right? On the other hand, we don't want to downplay the liturgical as if it's just incidental, when in fact it is quite directly related to the ministry of charity. And if we investigate carefully some of the different elements of the deacon's liturgical role, they are very often the places where the liturgy itself, which we might consider an ad intra activity, is pointing ad extra. If a deacon is responsible for the prayers of the faithful, this is where we pray for the world. This is an ad extra activity. Of course, the most obvious one of these things is the deacon is the one who tells us to get out of here, right? So even the liturgical ministry of the deacon, while it's an ad intra activity, is directed ad extra. And so when we get outside the walls, and very often this is where we will encounter Christians of other communions and traditions and denominations, what is the relationship then between the common worship, which we can't share in its fullness, and service, which has less limitations on what we can do together? And how does the experience of serving together outside the walls influence the way we experience the incomplete nature of our ability to worship together? And is a deacon a person who can live in that space and model for us in a way the kind of brokenness? And so in a way, this is also a place in which a deacon is a person at the margins. The brokenness of the church and the necessity of the ecumenical movement is because of a marginal situation. This is not the way we are supposed to be in relationship with one another. So I think there's a lot of room for a deacon in his or her ministry to consider when I'm relating to other Christians, whether it's in service or maybe it's in my family or at my workplace or whatever, and how is that related? How is my ability to serve or be in relationship with, in a certain way, highlight the brokenness of our inability to worship together? And how do I bring forth that kind of marginalization and catalyze and make aware my community with respect to that kind of marginalization? Because one of the things we know about the diaconate is it's sometimes called the eyes and the ears of the bishop, right? They're the people often in a context where maybe a priest, not always, but Frederick talked about the people in his parish relating to him differently. They might share things with him that they might not share with the priest. And very often, because of your context and your role, a deacon might be in a place to hear things that they can bring forth then to the community to consider where is that woundedness. And so this brings me to maybe the wrap-up of the theoretical piece, where Bishop Don talked about in ecumenical dialogue, we shouldn't just bring our best China tea set, but we should bring our woundedness. Well, deacons should have a key role there because their ministry of service should put them in a place to be able to label in a quite clear way often what the character of that woundedness in our communities is. Mélan talked in her introduction about the powers and principalities and about being with the Anawim, the little ones. My experience of this will be quite limited compared to those of you who've spent years in the kind of ministry that Mélan has been involved in. But we know that when we spend time and we listen to the people who are on the outside, we gain a perspective on the structures that we can't get when those structures are serving ourselves pretty well, right? And so I recently... So I'm employed in a structure, and I have certain attitudes and understandings and whatever of how employment works in that structure, but I recently had a conversation with a person who's unemployed but qualified to work in a similar structure. And it changed the way I saw the way certain things are done and the way certain decisions are made in a way that I never could have got there by reflecting on my own experience, but only by talking to the unemployed person and hearing that person's, what does the situation look like to them from the outside? Was I able to see something that I never would have seen before? Well, that kind of experience should be quite common to the deacon who is in relationship face-to-face with people on the outside in many ways, and to bring that to the structures of the church, including finally the bishop, and that would inform the way we talk with other Christians when we say, what are the challenges our churches are facing? What are the challenges our culture is facing? How do we engage one another? How do we learn from one another? How do we admit where we even need to learn and what our wounds might be? So that's some of the theoretical ideas that have come to me in listening to these presentations and some of the earlier presentations of this conference. I want to finish by just making a couple, sharing a couple experiences that have happened in our diocese or will be happening in our diocese in terms of diaconate and ecumenism. We're about to ordain 9 men next month, and we've been working for several months on their placements. Where will they go in terms of parishes, but also in terms of service placements? And there are several contexts in which the ecumenical nature of their ministry is basically unavoidable. And thankfully, given our bishop, will not just be sort of surreptitiously done because it's unavoidable, but will in fact be endorsed and encouraged. So for example, we have a small town where there is one church, and it happens to be a Catholic church, but not everyone who lives in the town is a Catholic. Many people throughout the town refer to the diaconate candidate in that town as the preacher. In a kind of colloquial way, he's already serving in funeral ministry. Really, it's not just directing the funeral; it's actually a ministry to people, whether they are Catholic or not, and has really gained the trust of his community and is a presence of Christ's church in that community, whether you're Catholic or not. Right? That's one context. We have another context of a small town that is surrounded by, I think, 4 reservations, 4 reserves. There's a Catholic church in the town. None of the reserves are Catholic. Now, history is a little complicated, but the basic idea is that we didn't fight. We didn't go onto the reserves together. We kind of divided them up before we got onto the reserves, and none of the ones around were Catholic. There's Anglican presence, and so the question was, well, I know an Anglican priest who does some ministry on the reserves, and if I was called into that ministry, could I work with her, and what would that look like? And the answer was, absolutely, let's see what that might look like. Let's talk with her, and you have a great relationship and all that stuff, right? So 2 rural contexts. Now here's an urban context. The Catholic Church, I don't know how long ago, 10, 15 years maybe, lost our sort of last inner city parish in Regina. So there's a vacuum in North Central in terms of Catholic ministry. And there's an evangelical ministry, Healing Hearts ministry, that does work with gang members and other people who live in that part of town. And our diaconate formation program has developed a relationship with the evangelical pastor who works there, and there is the potential that at least one of our candidates may end up working as part of their diaconal ministry in an evangelical ministry in North Central, right? And so those are, and what that looks like in the long term, we don't know exactly. Are there times when there would be liturgical functions whereby it would be clear that this is a Roman Catholic deacon in an evangelical context? These are things we'll have to figure out as we go forward. We don't have all the answers yet. So that goes to placement of deacons and deacons working out, ad extra. In terms of the formation of deacons, we're not really in a position to run a joint formation program, but we've cooperated in our formation program. Both Deacon Michael and 1 minute. Oh, thank you, Joe. And Canon Catherine were presenters in our diaconate formation program, and as the Anglican diocese was discerning what their own diaconate formation program would look like, they brought me in for a meeting and to consult and to learn from what we had done with one another. And I would anticipate, given our covenant relationship, and to be honest, just the positive experience of working together, that we're going to continue to do that. In the past, here, with a very limited number of deacons, there were some meetings between Catholic and Anglican deacons that have kind of dropped off, and I think at least in part because the numbers were quite small. Well, those numbers are going up on both sides soon, and it would not be at all surprising if something like annual or biannual meetings of Roman Catholic and Anglican deacons were to happen in this archdiocese. So there's some concrete, practical things that are happening and may happen in the future.